welcome to VarnVlog. And today we have Colin Drumm. I would say back, but actually you've not technically been on this show before. I've just interviewed you in other places. So Colin and I have had a long dialogue going back now probably off and on for 5-6 years, where occasionally we're allies and occasionally we yell at each other on Twitter or Facebook or something. And Colin shares my distrust of a certain hermeneutic that emerges out, the emergence or the reemergence maybe of German idealism. And I wanted Colin to come on and talk about why. I mean, I'm going to also let you talk about your background in this, how maybe it's limited some of your other academic studies, but how did you get to a place where you felt like you needed to declare a nearly wholly academic crusade on the persistence of German idealism?
Yeah, it's kind of quixotic. I mean, yeah, it's so I wanted to. I was on before interviewing Varn, and we talked about some of my research about. I was being interviewed. We talked about my research on money and some of my critiques of Marx on value theory and stuff like that. So here I want to talk about Kant and partly I got to Kant in the way that a lot of people get to the German idealism through Marx. I mean, you start studying Marx and then you discover that there's Hegel lurking beyond it, and then you study Hegel and you realize that Kant is lurking behind it, and so my interest in Kant has kind of happened accidentally and as a byproduct of the kind of stuff that I talked about last time with the money politics and all of that. So I kind of want to begin by kind of talking about how my research into money led me to like almost like the way I would put it, like I stepped on this landmine called Kant and it like blew off my leg. And then I was like, oh, there's something here. And I didn't know there was going to be anything there before that happened. So like kind of the line of thought that led me to thinking about Kant. I mean, because I read Kant in undergrad and it didn't mean anything to me. It was just a thing that was on the syllabus and there it is. It's part of the taxonomy of different kind of philosophies there are. And I read him again in a grad seminar, and it didn't really mean that much to me. But I got started thinking about it because a lot of my research is about the politics of debt cancellation, or the politics. When you start thinking about money and you start thinking about the long history of money, what a lot of those political struggles are about debasement of the coinage. That's what people are mad about. And the reason that they're mad about this is because when you debase the coinage, you fuck with the debt, right? So if I owe you money and the coin gets debased, then I'm paying you back something less than I promised. And so this is really a kind of ethical scandal associated with coinage. And as I was thinking about this, I noticed like that in ethical thinking in Western philosophy, the paradigm of the lying promise is really central, right? So in Plato's Republic, the question of the lying promise is the first question that gets raised that eventually leads to saying what is justice and what is the republic and all of this. And it's the question of, if you give your friend a sword and he goes mad and you give it back to him, are you doing what you promised or not? And so and this is what leads Plato to try to find, he's trying to find an abstract concept of value that lies beyond nominal promises, right? So we make nominal promises, but there could be a way in which we fulfill our nominal promise that would actually violate justice, or it seems like this. And so how do we find value, right? So Plato says, if you're giving back the sword, you're giving something bad, whereas what you owe is something good. So what you owe is not the sword, but something good. So we have this concept of value that's going to let us deal with this question of the lying promise, right? And so it's there in Plato. It's the when we start thinking about justice, the first thing we think about, you break your promises. And of course, the promise is paradigmatically a contract, right? It's a promise to pay money. And that's exactly where Plato then next goes, is a promise to pay money. So much of the monetary system is really credit, and credit is really a kind of promise. And so in thinking about the politics of coinage and the way that it relates to the credit system, I got interested in this question of the ethics of breaking promises as it is understood in the Western tradition. And it's this paradigm case, and it gets raised by Plato but it gets taken up again by Kant in Kant's Second Critique. In there's different versions of the Second Critique, but in all of them, when Kant is reaching for an example of an unjust action, the first one that he finds is breaking a promise, making a lying promise. And really what that means is that the paradigm of injustice is the failure to pay your debts. And so I saw this as kind of connected to a creditor ideology, right? That much of Western thinking is, is from the perspective of elites, and elites are the people to whom money is owed. And so they think it's really important that you have to keep your promises always as a categorical imperative. And so I wrote a paper that was about a number of this stuff, and I kind of in passing talked about Kant, and I made this argument, right, that we have this in Western philosophy, we have this paradigm case of the lying promise as being the ultimate unjust action. Maybe we should be critical of this because this is kind of like creditor ideology, right? I mean, what about debt jubilee, right? I mean, like, what about bankruptcy? I mean, what about freeing people from debt? I mean, couldn't that be what we want to do? But in if we take seriously what Kant is saying, what he's saying is that this is the categorical wrong in society. And so I wrote this paper and I presented it in my department, and there was a professor who responded to the paper, and they were really angry at me for saying this about Kant. And they looked at me and said, "The Kantians will destroy you." And this was the first moment that it occurred to me that there were Kantians. Like, I knew there were like Marxists and Foucauldians and like there are even like Hegelians, but like the idea that there were Kantians was kind of foreign to me because I couldn't imagine cathecting onto Kant, right? I mean, I understand as much as I have a criticism of Marx, and I think that there's problems with his theory, I understand the cathexis into Marx, right? I mean, I went through that phase myself. I mean, Marx, I understand why you would be attached to Marx in this way, but I didn't understand it at Kant. It just mystified me. And this was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and I've kind of been thinking about it ever since. And for reasons that I think we'll talk about as we go on. I mean, it's led me to a consideration of the problem of Kant's racism, which there's a whole debate about too, which we'll talk about in a second. But I'll give you a chance to respond to what I said first before I go on.
There's a whole lot there. I mean, one of the interesting things that you see, I remember reading Kolakowski's Main Currents of Marxism, a book that I thought was a former vulgar Marxist vulgar repudiation of Marx, but I was fascinated with one of the ideas that he wrote before he split with Marx in the middle of the book, actually, which was tracing the intellectual current of Marxism, not through materialism or even Epicurean materialism, but actually through Neoplatonism and Platonist ontologies. Now, I kind of think this is wrong. I think Marx is actually more Aristotelian in a lot of ways,
right.
But there is a way in which this idea of debt and of aristocrat, of like debt owed to aristocrats for giving you some of the stuff they took from someone else, basically, is mystified in Plato, and it's one of the key things that I saw that I thought Nietzsche was right about when he was after idealism, is like there's his reasoning may not stand, who he blames for it may not stand, his idealization of power may not stand, but the idea that the morality develops as a way to mask power conflict, I think seems pretty, like, that insight, regardless of the other accoutrement around it, seems to be legitimate.
Yes.
And it seems that there's a way in which German idealism, through its relationship with classical idealism and Plato and all that, has a lot of these conflations of the normative and the descriptive. And I mean, it's even kind of a problem in Marxism, to be frank, but I know when you get into like Kantian deontology, it's the point. The is-alt distinction is is an accident of like fallen nature or something. It's not something that you should take seriously. And that does seem to permeate economic thought. It permeates moral reasoning in a way that's interesting, because a lot of people who see this problem, I think, in monetary terms or in terms of class, don't see it in terms of the way this is constructed in ethics in general, because that's scary and reminds us of reactionaries like Nietzsche.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it also, I mean, it brings us into Carl Schmitt land, which is another thing that people are scared to go, right? I mean, the problem is, well, I mean, let me put it in context. I mean, so, part of what I've been interested in and what I've been studying is the development of interest-bearing debt as a social technology, which basically is invented in kind of Mesopotamia and Egypt. I mean, Bronze Age empires, and these empires had an institution of, the king is a god, and because the king is a god, he can intervene into debts. And so these societies that developed interest-bearing debt originally kind of had with it a constitution that allowed them to manage the socially disruptive effects of the debt system. And they essentially had to do this because they had to maintain the social basis of the army. If they let debt just compound infinitely and everybody fall into debt, then everybody gets enslaved by their creditors, because that's what you do. That's what happens. And then you have no more free population to be your army. And so they had to have a mechanism for writing down debts, and it was part of the Constitution. But it also involved the idea of the divinity of the sovereign, and the idea that the sovereign is above the law of contracts. And what happens in the West is that, well, these kind of in the Iron Age, they import the technology of interest-bearing debt, but they resist this constitution that says that the sovereign is above the law of contracts, and this is a major problem in classical Western political thinking, and especially in Plato's Statesmen. I think is really the place where you see it, and that's where this political theological problem gets set up that people like Carl Schmitt in the 20th century are inheriting, and here the whole question is whether the sovereign is above or below the law, and that very much means is the sovereign bound by his promises? Can he make a contract, or is he the guy who's above all the contracts? And what Plato concludes in the Statesman is that, well, it's actually bad to either have a sovereign who's above the law or below the law. It's actually so Plato recognizes that if you don't have a mechanism to decide on the exception, right? If you don't have a political mechanism that says, yes, normally you have to pay your debts, but here it would be in the interest of the social good to have an exception. So we're going to make an exception. You don't have to do what you promised. He recognizes that this is necessary because he recognizes that if his example is if you make a law and then the lawgiver goes away, so like Solon, well, if he comes back, is he able to change the law or not? And so he recognizes that if you don't have some kind of sovereignty that's above the law of contracts, this could have socially deleterious consequences. I mean, the laws could themselves become a tyrant, and so he recognizes the necessity of having a way to decide on the exception. But then he says, but we don't know how to find it. It's actually aporetic. It's impossible. We can't find the true art of the statesman. And so therefore it would be better to err on the side of having a sovereign below the law who's not able to decide to break contracts. But what this means is that it's safer to err on the side of the creditors, right? Because the creditors are always the ones who want contracts to be enforced. And this, I think, is a very deep problem in Western political thinking, but that kind of comes out in something that looks like pure ethics outside of politics, right? And Kant is very insistent that whenever all political questions are subservient to questions of right. So Kant says politics can never have precedence over right, and so really politics is downstream from ethics, which the ultimate consequence of that position is to say, well, the creditors win all the tiebreakers, because if we ever awarded the tiebreaker to the debtors, then, well, we would undermine the entire basis of society. There would be total chaos, and that's what we can't have. So this is the problem that I've been thinking about that led me to a consideration of Kant, just because when I started pointing out that Kant's ethics, well, I mean, if you tried to apply it, you would have a society in which the creditors win forever, because there's no, there's an absolute categorical imperative to always pay your debts. People got really mad at me, and then I started wondering why people were so mad at me. I mean, and the character of that anger was different than the character of the anger when people get mad at me for criticizing Marx. And that's what I got interested in, because I've been yelling at people about Marx on the internet for years and years and years. So I've met a lot of people that I know. I mean, it's the national pastime, right? But the Kant thing felt like there was like people lost it. Like it wasn't like, well, I'm mad at you because Marx is going to bring the revolution and you're a kind of revolutionary. It was like this unthinking anger. It was like, I felt like people were like hissing at me about
like you've attacked their being in a way, not just their political project, right?
Yeah, exactly. It felt deeper and more personal, and just I've been trying to figure out what that energy was about, and what was, because I just felt like there's something going on here, and so I think there is something going on here that we can get into as we go forward. But
well, I mean, so you mentioned something in hindsight, but there is a way. I remember thinking Zizek once made an argument, and this will get to some of the racial stuff you want to talk about, but I think it'll get to a bunch of things, that the idealists were always less likely to be racialist because empiricists tend to naturalize their framework, and idealists for some reason don't. So like Aristotle talks about natural slaves, and Plato believes in human liberation, question mark. I don't know how you reconcile that with either the Republic or the Politics. And this was particularly put up by Alain Badiou. And I just remember thinking about all the German idealists and going, really? Because yeah, we can find awful stuff that John Locke said about race, and how how his conception of self-ownership basically only applied to like British people of fair complexion and ownership of property. But you have to ignore what Hegel and Kant and Schiller, and I mean, there's almost nobody who doesn't naturalize types and typologies in German idealism, and project them back. And yes, you might have an ethical critique that's absolute to push back on your heuristics, but it doesn't seem to matter that much.
Well, I mean, what's crazy about this is that the with Hegel, it's there. I mean, people still read the lectures on world history and stuff. I mean, and this is the place where Hegel is talking about how nothing happens in Africa and this sort of thing. But so people kind of know this about Hegel, but it seems, and so now we're getting into the real issue. I think it seems that this has been kind of suppressed about Kant, and it seems so. Kant wrote more about anthropology and geography than he did about anything else.
Right. And he wrote way more about race than Hegel.
Yeah. I mean, so Kant, let's put it this way. Kant is interested in race in the same way that Newton is interested in angels, right? Like we remember Newton for whatever physics stuff, but what he really cared about was angels, right? I mean, that was what he was obsessed with. Mm-hmm. And with Kant, it's similar. I mean, Kant was really obsessed with race science, and well, for reasons I'm going to kind of try to lay on the table. I mean, his philosophy really arose out of the problems that he was trying to think about when he was looking at anthropology and race science, and so this is part of so it seems that after World War II, Kant's writings on race were kind of suppressed to the extent that people who are Kant scholars are surprised by even the idea that Kant and race would be a topic, right? So people who have done this work, like Emmanuel Eze and Bernasconi and some, they write about this, right? I mean, when they were kind of first uncovering, maybe, I don't know, 80s, 90s and stuff, they were uncovering some of these writings that it seems like everybody knew about them before the war, and after the war, everybody forgot about them, and they're bringing them back up, and but what's interesting is that, so everybody acknowledges this now, right? They kind of won this point. Like, look, I mean, it's hard to deny. I mean, Kant, there's voluminous writings in which Kant, there's a text in which he instructs you on the best way to whip your slaves and other things like this. I mean, and I mean, we could go through and we could read stuff from Kant, and it's all horrible. But so the defenders of Kant in academia have been forced to kind of admit this, right? They is undeniable. But it's interesting, but there's sort of been a standoff, which is around the question of, okay, so what does this mean for like Kant's philosophy? Like, does it matter that he's a racist, or is there like his empirical interest, which is racist, and his pure philosophy, and it's not, and it's fine. We can still be Kantians without worrying about all of this Kant stuff. And this is where the debate kind of is right now. But I think so. So what I want to go on to say is, I mean, I think there's reasons. I think we actually understand Kant better as a thinker. Like, if our goal is to read Kant and understand what's going on in Kant's head, I think we understand Kant a lot better if we understand.
It's easier to do, for one thing, but go ahead.
What's easier to do?
Understand Kant as opposed to Hegel, but
yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, well, that's good. I mean, Kant is really not that complicated of a thinker,
right? Which is why the analytics kind of like him,
right? Yeah. It's kind of, I mean, yeah.
To piss on my own stopping ground,
yeah.
But that's what we're doing these days.
Yeah.
But yeah. So, how do you think this is more categorically related? How is this obsession with anthropology and proto race science and all that?
Yeah.
Crucial, analogous to the way that we forget that calculus is basically so that Newton could calculate both money and angels, and
right.
And when the end times was supposed to happen.
Yeah, I mean, so it's funny. So I want to talk. I'll get to that in just a second. I want to talk a little bit about so there's a defense strategy that the Kantians have to apologize for Kant, given this, and I'll talk about that, and then I'll go into what is Kant actually doing here, right? And their defense strategy is to say basically, Kant is so they always begin by telling you what a great philosopher Kant is. Like, all of the essays open this way. They're like, Kant is the greatest philosopher of all time, blah 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 blah. But then they go on to argue basically that really Kant's philosophy implies everything that we believe in our common sense, right? So everything that we believe in our kind of our post-war liberal common sense is actually what Kant's philosophy really implies. But Kant himself was like too stupid to realize this. So Kant, his entire life, has this philosophy, and really the implication of it is post-war liberalism. But Kant didn't understand that. He wasn't like clever enough in order to correctly apply his own principles. So all of the defense strategies take this tack basically to say we can underwrite our beliefs using Kant as an authority. And using Kant as an authority, we're going to dismiss what Kant actually thought, right? So that he's incompetent at applying his own principles, the stuff that he thinks about everything else. So I think if we want to say, okay, let's give Kant some credit, like Kant actually is, maybe he's overrated as a philosopher, but he's not an idiot. He is if there is some glaring discrepancy between this philosophy he obsessively has and all of these other things he obsessively talks about, like, let's assume there's some connection there. And I think the way to understand the connection is that Kant doesn't understand what the purpose of human beings is, right? He thinks that we need to. So he's in some of his writings he says this, right? He talks about like the Tahitian Islanders or something, and he says I don't see any reason that they should exist. So Kant is faced with basically human diversity, right? He's obsessively reading all of these travel reports and everything, and he's obsessively contemplating human diversity, right? But of course, Kant thinks, and his point of his own philosophy is that we have to have an idea that we reach out of pure reason first before we can understand the world. We need some sort of pure rational principle in order to judge the world. And so Kant really develops the point of the critique of pure reason is to develop a theory of a pure rational being that we can use to then judge empirical humans on whether they live up to it or not. right? So you brought up the is-ought distinction, and there is an is-ought distinction in Kant, right? And it's actually fundamental to his second critique, because there's the is that humans are as they exist, empirical humans, which for Kant are the objects of anthropology. Those are the humans that exist. But that's not the question. The question is, what should humans be? So we need a theory of what humans should be in order to live up to their concept as rational creatures. And that's what we're going to do in order to judge empirically existing humans, whether they live up to that standard or not, right? And I think the point here is that if we don't begin by thinking that's necessary, right? If we're not trying to judge empirical humans to decide whether or not they live up to the concept of being human, whether they fulfill the purpose of humanity or not, then there's no motivation to want to do what Kant did in the first place, right? So in Kant, and I brought some receipts if we want to look at the text. I have a folder full of screenshots of Kant if you don't believe me. But in Groundwork of Metaphysics of Morals, he begins by saying basically, well, the only ethics that are worth anything are the ethics that come from a pure origin. So we have to have you have to have the dignity of a pure origin that's going to give us the foundation of ethics, and we're going to use this in order to judge whether human beings deserve happiness or not. And this is the purpose of the project. And so Kant begins by setting up a value hierarchy, right? That purity is good and beautiful, and mixture is bad and ugly. And this is what motivates the project. But if I don't take that on board, then I have no reason to even want to keep reading the book after that. There's no reason to want to be a Kantian. That's the reason that he gives. But he also doesn't justify it in with the rigor that he demands of everything else in his theory, right? He doesn't derive for me why purity is good and is the ground of dignity and happiness. All he does in his writing is kind of summon up his disgust at mixture and popularity, and then ask me to assent to it. And it's only once I do that I can then begin to derive the rest of the system of transcendental idealism, right? So I think there's a philosophical flaw here in his thought, which derives from this, right? Sort of there's this arbitrary transcendental disgust at mixture that makes the whole thing possible and necessary.
I mean, it's interesting because it arrives at again, it seems to emerge out of that Platonic, obsession with pure forms and pure types. Yeah. But there's kind of a double move there. So I can get to what I meant when I said like he conflates the is-ought, because the purity distinction is a conflation of the is-ought difference. There's a hidden value there. Right. Yeah. Like that is the philosophical error. So he's insisting that there is he's not going to fall into that stuff that Hume criticized those measly French people for. And Kant was definitely engaged with Hume. So he's going to accept the is-ought distinction, but because of his obsession with pure types, and because he hides the fact that purity involves a normative judgment in the initial instance, he's actually both trying to have his cake and eat it too in regards to normative descriptive distinctions, right? So I definitely see the problem there. It's also interesting that you focus on the fact that while everything is supposedly derived from pure positive principles, like the categorical imperative, which is this law that even Kant's own drawing up of leads to logical paradoxes nearly immediately, as far as the way the categories go. But when you look at it in terms of disgust and you're realizing, oh, all this is a justification for for trying to prove kinds of disgust and basically psychological heuristics and cultural norms, but to make it seem like it comes out of a place of absolute reason, it paints the project in a fundamentally different light. And you see the post hoc ergo propter hoc nature of a lot of the entire edifice, which is interesting because actually I know a lot of anti-Kantians who don't portray this way. They don't go into where Kant is deriving his universal types or are that much. They just mock the idea because it leads to a logical paradox.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm not playing gotcha with Kant like he's a paradox. Like I think we have to understand what motivates his thinking. Like I don't know. I read philosophy like a literature student, right? I mean, philosophy to me is just a genre of literature.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm mostly interested in like what story is being told here, right? I always frame things in terms of narrative. So I want to know what story Kant is telling, right? And for this is part of why I'm unsympathetic to other kinds of attempts to save Kant, where it says, well, okay, well, we can just sort of, Kant is just kind of a bundle of propositions, and we can kind of take the ones we like and discard the ones we don't like, and that's fine. But when you think about it that way, you're not asking what kind of story is Kant telling, right? What kind of narrative is he setting up? And I think that is dangerous, because then you can lose track of, well, you might be like re-performing that same narrative without realizing that that's what you're doing. So I think that's so, and I think, like, you know, when we understand the story that Kant is telling, like, you know, we have to understand why Kant thinks that we can't learn about ethics from anthropology, right? And what he means by that, just the empirical study of human society. Like, we can't learn about ethics from that, because it's going to taint us, right? I mean, he really uses this language, like it's going to taint the dignity of our pure origin, and so if you have a reading of Kant's ethics that doesn't begin by saying, well, like, the story that Kant is telling is that we're disgusted by the sub-objects of anthropology. Empirically existing humans disgust us, and we need some kind of pure concept that we can judge them with, and to determine whether they're really living up to the purpose of humanity, right? Because Kant believes that the human species has a purpose that needs to be fulfilled. I can talk more. That's where our story is going, right? But I think it's like, yeah, I mean, again, you know, you gotta like, and also I think Kant would be unsympathetic to this, right? Because Kant thinks there has to be this idea that we have first, that then determines everything else that we can think or experience. And when you reduce Kant to just kind of a set of propositions rather than a story, you're not asking, okay, like, but what's the idea that Kant is talking about here? And I think that the idea or the story that Kant is setting up, it really is inextricable from white supremacy. Like, there is no non-white supremacist reading of Kant. Like, that's my view.
Would you go into, I mean, there seems to be lots of kinds of supremacy, actually, you're detecting here. Would you go into the white supremacy argument, and then also maybe the other kinds of obscured relations that he's hiding? Mm-hmm. You implied one in the beginning, like that by naturalizing debt, you actually hide that there's a differential in power for how that debt arose and how that credit arose, right?
Yeah. Well, so part of the line of thinking that's led me here, you know, is I mean, partly thinking that the Marxist theory is inadequate for thinking about race. So I'm definitely somebody who thinks that race is not a modality in which we experience class. I don't think that is the case. And so I think that, like, Marxist theories that try to understand race purely in terms of labor power, right, differential prices of labor power or something like this, I think are missing something that is connected with the way that Marxists miss finance, right? Because I think that structural racism is in many ways a financial phenomenon. So if we think about racialized subjects, particularly Black subjects after pseudo emancipation, as part of the role that they play in political economy is as being the bearers of bad debt, right? That is, and there are, I won't get into it too much, but I mean, there are ways in which, when we kind of understand how credit money works, right, we can then reframe this to say, well, actually, the system of white supremacy uses Black people as money, right? They actually are a way to generate monetary assets. This is true in slavery. And then the argument would be, well, there's elements of this system, of this logic, that persist even after formal emancipation. And so understanding Black people as structural bad debtors in political economy requires us to kind of go beyond some Marxist analytics. This is sort of the thing I was thinking through. And so that's why, you know, that's connected to the stuff about debt abolition and all of this. And I lost my train of thought, so respond to what I said, and I'll remember what I was going to go next.
Yeah. So there's definitely a relation of power being obscured, and I think this is maybe the better way to understand it from your perspective, because if we don't want to, and I also agree with you when you look at the history of race, it's co-emergent with modern capitalist notions of class, but can't really be reduced to it.
Yeah.
And in some ways, for example, if you look at like modern monetary schemes versus the emergence of transatlantic slavery, modern monetary schemes actually come later. And I don't mean like monetary theory. I just mean like money as it exists now. Right. And similar with mercantilist credit organs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I always like to use, when you want to see the rawest assertion of what debt and credit actually are, look at Rhodesia.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right.
Yeah. So, and yes, there's class elements to that. That's undeniable. But the racialized element, which actually was explicitly used to keep a class element from developing, but was separate from, like, particularly because you weren't proletarianizing already proletariat import labor from the European colonies, but you sure as hell were proletarianizing. We're not even talking about peasants. We're talking about people who were essentially hunter-gatherers forced to claim parcels of historic land and then forced to pay for it in a foreign currency at reduced wage rates at near slavery conditions.
Yeah. So the point here is that well, enslaved people are not only laborers, they are laborers, but in addition to that, they're also capitalized assets. And so and so the problem is that the Marx theory assumes that workers are not capitalized assets, that what's being capitalized is fixed capital and variable capital is not capitalized. That's sort of an assumption of his theory. But the problem is, well, when you're thinking about a system based on the enslavement of people, you're also, these people can be capitalized, and so they play a role that is neither variable nor fixed capital in terms of Marx, and so what do you do then, right?
Marxists always treat them as fixed capital, like,
yeah, but they're also variable capital.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I mean, like, if you look at it like from the pure definitions, when I really think about it, the cost of maintaining slaves is vary, and you can underfeed them, so you can't treat them the same way you treat machine inputs.
Yes.
Right. But they also are not free labor, and the variable doesn't work anything like a variable in exploiting free labor. I actually even thought about that problem. Okay.
Good. So that's a deep problem, and it's a big problem that, well, it begins to really be a problem towards the end of Kant's career. I need to look more into the exact details of this, but my understanding is that I believe there to be a kind of financial bubble in slave assets in the early 19th century. So I think that part of this the problem that we're looking at when we're looking at the run up to the American Civil War, I mean, enslaved people are literally being securitized and turned into mortgage-backed securities and marketed to German institutional investors. Like, does that sound familiar? It's literally what happened before 2008. It's exactly the same kind of financial instrument. So this is one I have not looked into all of this in detail yet. It's one of the things I'm interested to find out more about. But we see this in, so like Olaudah, there's hints if you read Olaudah Equiano's interesting narrative, which is contemporary with Kant. There's some hints at this, I think. I might talk more about him in a minute. Anyway, so this is kind of the problem that led me to. But okay, I want to go back to you mentioned stuff about what Kant is concealing, right? So here I want to go into maybe the next part of it, which is that. So I was turning all this stuff over in my head, and Kant has really been on the back burner. It's like, it's not what I've been mainly thinking about, but it pops up every once in a while, and I get mad about it every time it does, and then I go read Kant again, and I've been reading the secondary literature, I've been reading this debate and stuff, and I, in the course of I began to suspect, right? I was reading this thing, and I was like, you know what? I actually don't think that chattel slavery can be prohibited. In the system that Kant has laid out, I actually think that I was like, wait a second. Like, if I tried to mount an argument for why like chattel slavery was against Kantian ethics. Like, could I do it? And what I discovered is that I really actually don't think you can. I think that Kant intentionally made this very difficult, and it's tricky. There's places in his text where he almost looks like he's doing it, and the Kantians grab onto a few moments and they try to do this. But if you look carefully, what they are doing, what many Kantians do when they read this, is they ignore a distinction that is made very early on in Metaphysics of Morals, and that is in fact central to Kant's entire thought, which is the difference between phenomenon and noumenon, right? So you might think, so if Kant says something like this, right, you have to honor the humanity in everybody else or whatever. This is one of the categorical imperative things, right? Well, doesn't that mean that you can't enslave people? Because he says you must treat the humanity in others as an end in itself rather than a means to an end. Okay, so doesn't that mean that you can't have chattel slaves because then you're using other people as a means to an end? Well, okay, but let's remember that in Kant, the whole point is that on the one hand there's phenomena, and on the other hand there's noumenon, and those are very different things. And in the first chapter of Metaphysics of Morals, on like the second page, he says, well, there's homo noumenon and there's homo phenomenon, right? So there are some people who appear to be human, but just because they appear to be human doesn't mean they're human. That's the whole point of Kant, right? We have to know whether they are homo noumenon, whether they are really human. And how do we do that? Well, we have to construct a theory of pure reason, and we use that to judge them about whether they live up to it. And if they do, then they're homo noumenon, and if they don't, then they're homo phenomenon. And Kant says, well, some entities appear to be human, but in fact they're nothing but an appearance. And so if you begin with this theory, well, okay, then go look at everything Kant says about slavery. Okay, mm-hmm. And the only times that he's placing limitations on slavery, right? So Kant says every human is born free, right? And so you can't. And so he says if you're enslaved for a crime, right? So Kant believes penal slavery is ethical because you committed a crime. But he says, well, but if you've committed a crime, then you can't pass down the status of servitude to your children because all humans are born free. Well, okay, if you ignore the appearance reality distinction, then it sounds like he's prohibiting chattel slavery. But if say I'm a Kantian the Confederacy wins the Civil War and there's Confederate Kantians and they're trying to use Kant to justify their society. Well, they could do it. They say well, black people just appear to be human, but they're not actually human. And why aren't they human? Well, because they don't look at them. I mean, they don't know how to use pure reason, and they don't behave ethically. And so they're not really human, and so none of this stuff applies to them. I mean, you can do that with Kant. There is no probe. And
it seems like we lost Colin. Let's give him a minute.
Hey, sorry about that.
No problem.
This worked. I just switched to my cell phone. As I think I was saying before, and I cut off. Right. I mean, if you say, well, some humans only appear to be humans, others are really humans, and then we justify this, then you can defend it. And if you say, well, I'm going to be a Kantian, but I'm going to assume that everything that looks like a human actually is a human, well, then there's no reason to want to be a Kantian, because distinguishing those things was the purpose of the theory. That's what he says in the very beginning of the text. So you would have to find a totally un-Kantian reasons to be a Kantian, at which point, why bother being a Kantian? Why not just make your own philosophy and tell a different story that begins in a different place?
Okay. So why do you think there's such a refusal to abandon the Kantian form of German idealism?
Yeah, well, so I think that, so as I've been thinking about, like the emotional response from people that I got for raising these things, and it confused me because people were calling me. One thing that people called me was undergrad. People, like 3 or 4 different people said the same thing. They said, you're being an undergrad, which is, I have some thoughts about that. And then they were saying, but then they would present to me readings of Kant that were like refuted on page 1, right? So there's a Rawlsian Kant that some people believe in, which is the utilitarian Kant, which is like, well, really what the categorical imperative says is that if everybody did it, then we'd all be better off. It like reduces categorical imperative to a Nash equilibrium. But Kant hates this because Kant says, we can't have any consideration of ends. He's very clear that the categorical imperative is not a Nash equilibrium. So they would call me undergrad, and then they would present this reading of Kant, and I'm like, but it doesn't. I was just looking at the book. It doesn't say that, And whenever people start saying like the same phrases to me, I'm like, okay, it's like not really you talking. It's some kind of brainworm inside you that is, and so like, what's going on? Well, I think that like part of this anger about Kant is this idea. Well, first of all, Kant kind of like is the foundation of 200 years of Western European philosophy. Everybody's responding.
Yeah, both continental and analytic. He's one of the few figures after the emergence of German idealism that you can refer to on both sides.
Yeah, exactly. He's the last universal Western philosopher, right? So he's the philosopher who guarantees that there's a coherence to Western thought, right? That there is a West, because if there's not Kant, then what common reference do we have? Well, it's not really clear. So this is one kind of issue. I think there's another kind of issue. Like people seem to think that Kant is like he's like the catacon, like holding back the reemerge. He's like holding back chaos from Europe, and that if like we can't ground ourselves in Kant, well then we don't really have a claim to being universal, right? I mean it's Kant that anchors this claim that says, well, the cultural production of the West in the 19th century is like the basis of universal reason, and it kind of underwrites this. So I think there's a way that Kant is understood as kind of underwriting post 1945 world order, and people are anxious that if you pull that rug out from underneath, then where do we go? And in a way, I also think this anxiety. This gets us into maybe the next section of the topic. I think there's also an element of Islamophobia going on here. So I think that in this desire to cling to Kant as the guy who can underwrite, whether he got the details of it right or not, well, he underwrites the idea that we could have a universal claim to world civilization based on our capacity as beings who can access pure reason. And I think this is threatened in some way by Black people and by Muslims who are in some ways overlapping categories. And so I kind of raised this topic by saying, look, so Kant says, in order to ground morality, we have to have this categorical principle. And this categorical principle is accessible to any being with pure reason. And he also thinks it's fairly trivial, right? He thinks it's actually pretty easy. Kant always says this. He's like, I can see in an instant, right? I can immediately see that such and such a thing is true. And so we have to be able to begin with kind of this abstract principle, and then derive from that, real principles of practical reason. The most important of which is, well, it is categorically wrong to make a lying promise, right? And well, the problem is that there is in fact an alternative claim to universality that holds something different, right? So in Islam also makes a claim to universality, right? I mean, so if we ask, okay, what's the core confession of faith in Islam? There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. Like, does that violate the categorical imperative? No, it doesn't, right? I can will that maxim should become a universal law without contradiction. There's absolutely no contradiction in willing that everybody should submit, right? I mean, that's totally without contradiction. And if I submit to Islam, then, well, I'm going to follow what's in the Sunnah. And in the Sunnah, I mean, they have a theory of lying promises. And in fact, there are situations in which making a lying promise is not only permitted, but is actually obligatory, right? So under Islamic law, you can be held liable for failing to make a lying promise under certain situations. I mean, if the life of another Muslim is in danger, you are actually obligated to make a lying promise. I mean, there's different schools of Islamic jurisprudence, and they differ in sometimes the situations that they deem as qualifying for this. But my understanding is that they all agree on the principle of so that there is an obligation for a lying promise. And so I think there's an anxiety here, which is like, there's another potential universality that comes to an opposite and incompatible conclusion from this framework that you're trying to forward. And it has consequences for the politics of creditor-debtor class politics. You know, it has lots of consequences, and you can't really refute that, right? So Kant is clear that there can be only one reason. There can, so Kantianism really has to make a claim to being the universal religion that all beings, if they're rational beings, have to live up to. And so there is, not only is there no Kantianism that is not white supremacy, it's also necessary to be an Islamophobe if you're a Kantian. Otherwise, you're inconsistent because well, I mean, Muslims, by confessing faith in Islam and following Islamic law, are saying that they're going to violate the law of pure reason as it is presented by Kant, and I think that's I mean, I take Islam seriously. I mean, so if I entertain Islam as something serious that I should consider their position, I find an alternative universality that draws incompatible consequences to Kant, and well, I mean, Kant says that there has to be one universal sovereign that's going to arbitrate over all of these things, and so where are you left, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. But I mean, it is interesting. I mean, just historically, if you talk about the historical emergence of race, and now I'm not coming down on Kant here, but like, it is tied to the ending of a social modality, an entire Christian superstructure. Like, you literally, yes. I mean, we know this textually. The Byzantine Empire falls. We have the Pope using the word European for the first time in print. Within 300 years, we have the word white used to be able to keep importing Africans who are Christians, because under previous slavery and just war mandates, you can't enslave Christians, and you definitely can't participate in a slave trade with an enemy power, be it Islamic or pagan, and give them money for Christian slaves. But you can once you invent a new racial category. The racial category itself expands and contracts actually based on religious notions. So when they thought they could convert China, Asians were white, and then after the Matteo Ricci stuff fails, we start seeing the development of the concept of yellow, which was not there for the first 300 or 400 years of race talk. And you don't have to even get into stuff like CRT, critical race theory, to know this. Like, this is pretty well accepted. There are, I mean, it's not that there's no talk of skin color in the ancient world. Like the Greeks talk about black skinned, white skinned, and yellow, but their yellow is Germans, so they mean blonde. So it's like
Xanthus,
yeah. but it's in general in the ancient world, it's not that big a deal. We see it emerge. And so it wouldn't surprise me that also you see like, you know, the whole Tula Assad, critique of secularity being that like it is because of its roots in the Enlightenment and particularly in laicism that that even in rejecting religion, it does so in a specifically Christian way that is disproportionately punishing of non-Christian cultural backgrounds. And I will say Marxists actually don't usually know what to do with this because so many people take the everything solid melts into air so literally that they don't realize like, hey, religious cultures actually really do change the way even like capital works in certain countries. That on the margin, like the larger imperatives of capital are pretty much consistent, but there's big differences in stuff like labor relations, intermediaries, what it's okay to do, what it's okay to ask for, how you can ask for it, stuff that actually does affect your daily life in pretty realistic and important ways, even if it's super structural. And actually, I would go so far to say that even in Marx, if you're really consistent on that metaphor, a lot of that stuff actually is down to relations of production, so it isn't super structural. But we can get lost in that.
Because the law organizes relations in society, and these systems are systems of law. I mean,
right? It does kind of get weird. It does kind of get weird when people like have to talk about legality and class origins and the class nature of the state and law, which if you my dispute with MMT is I think some of them are naive on what the state is and means, but
no.
And they're like, it's about ethics of care. Sure, buddy.
Right. Yeah. That's just embarrassing stuff. I mean, but I think you've hit on the key of it, right? Which is that really what Kant does is he secularizes Christianity and he turns Christianity into the legitimacy of pure reason, which Kant thinks is only embodied by white people, right? I mean, this is what he thinks. Kant goes through various theories. I mean, So to go back to something I mentioned earlier, right? I mean, it's very clear, and the text I recommend here to read if you really want to see, like, this is the closest thing to like Kant's like Scooby-Doo villain confession. I think really is this essay that's called it's called Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Aim, and this is where he really lays out very clearly that the purpose of humanity is only something that exists at a species level and not at an individual level, right? So it's humanity is an aggregate concept, not an individual concept, and the purpose of humanity is to live up to its concept of being a purely rational animal. And the problem is for Kant, only white people are actually capable of this. They're the only ones. So all humans have the potential for rationality in them, but Kant thinks that the colored races of the world have degenerated from Adam and Eve. So Kant basically thinks that all humans are born white, originally white, but that other races have degenerated because of the effects of climate on them and stuff.
So like a naturalized version of stuff like Hebrew Israelism or pre-71 Mormons or
right, exactly. It's very much like that, right? It's very much like Myth of Ham kind of stuff, right? And Kant even says, like, he says that Kant thinks that literally all human babies are born with white skin, but that black babies are only black on their genitals when they're born, and then it gradually spreads to the rest of their body, right? So Kant he says this is what he thinks.
Okay.
And
not from observation, I'm assuming.
No, I'm pretty sure that Kant never met a black person. I mean, I don't. I mean, he reads because he reads this travel literature and stuff. That's the basis of all of his and novels even. But so he thinks that the essence of the human animal is that it has the capacity for reason, but that this potential is not necessarily realized or realizable in all empirically existing humans. And there's an additional, there's a problem because humans have degenerated because of the effect of climate on them. At different points, he contemplates different solutions. I mean, at one point he contemplates like breeding black people out of existence. So Kant he doesn't believe in the one drop theory. He believes that basically after 6 generations, if you bred black people with white people, they would disappear or something like so he contemplates breeding them out of existence. He contemplates various things. But Kant thinks that the purpose of the human species is to realize its potential as a rational being, and that this is the purpose of this is what it means to treat humanity as an ends in itself, right? So you could actually read, if you read Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Aim, as this. So I like to imagine that I'm a Confederate Kantian, right? After the Confederacy wins the war, and I work in the university, and I'm explaining why Kant justifies the Confederacy in the same way that liberals today explain why Kant justifies everything they think. I could say, well, actually, we need to perpetuate chattel slavery of black people because this is helping us realize our purpose as rational beings, right? I mean, you could say, well, you could just put on your Aristotle hat, this is like, it's like, well, we need freedom from labor in order to be rational, and our slaves are helping us do that, and plus they're not really human because they only appear to be human
because they don't have all the rational assets like we do. Because
but it gets worse. But it gets worse, right? And it gets worse when we think about what does Kant have to say about slave rebellion, right? What would Kant say about the possibility of slave rebellion? And here I think is where things get really diabolical, right? Because suppose that enslaved people want to revolt and free themselves. What is the consequences of that for the rest of the world? Well, once we understand that enslaved people are the collateral for the financial system, if enslaved people want to emancipate themselves, they're going to cause a destruction of the credit system because they're no longer going to be there as collateral. And what that means is that they're actually interfering with the ability of rational subjects, of white Europeans, to fulfill their promises to each other, right? So say I promise to sell you my slave, and then the slave revolts. Well, now I'm not fulfilling my promise to you anymore. And so actually that revolting slave is threatening they're threatening a war that can't be contained, right? So also, right. So Kant says, well, basically, in order to make a peace treaty, you have to be able to trust the person that you're making the treaty with. And so if the person you're fighting is not rational, if they're not capable of keeping their promises, then you can't even, the war can only lead to extermination. And I'm confident this is how he would read revolting slaves, right? Not only are the revolting slaves threatening to interfere with the ability of white Europeans to fulfill their promises to one another, they're also, we can't trust them. They're irrational. They're going, they're going to open a war that is going to lead to the annihilation of the human race, and so we need to contain it, right? So I think there's a way in which Kant's logic can be harnessed to basically make the argument that basically when slaves rebel, they therefore prove that they deserve to be enslaved, right? Because the very act of rebellion is a demonstration of their non-rationality and thus their non-humanness, and thus, as he says in the groundwork, they don't even deserve to be happy, and they're also unworthy of dignity. Okay, and he says in the kingdom of ends, everything has either dignity or a price. Okay, and so if you've proven that you're unworthy of dignity, you must have a price. I mean, those are the only two options. Either you have dignity or you have a price. And there are certain conditions that Kant has laid out for us about whether you deserve dignity. And if you don't deserve dignity, then you either have to be exterminated or enslaved. Those are the only possibilities that are left if humanity is going to fulfill its teleological ends and justify its existence. I mean, this is the logic of Kant's thought. And I think he's kind of coy about it. I think there's an element of esoteric writing in Kant's thought because I actually think he doesn't know how the slavery question is going to end up, because the French Revolution abolished the slavery in 1794, which is basically like the year before Kant writes Perpetual Peace. And I think he didn't really know how it was going to end up, and I think Kant wanted to hedge his bets. I think Kant wanted to make sure that his philosophy could be used either by the victorious Confederacy or by the victorious abolitionists, and that both of them would be able to justify their world order in his terms. But I think he preferred slavery. I mean,
just using the logic of categorical imperatives. If you take rebellion as a category, rebellion gets a quote legitimate authority. If everyone is allowed to do it, whatever the reason, then it leads to social collapse, obviously. And Kant can't ever conceive of a possibility that social collapse could be just, although I hate talking about justice at all, but let's just give it there, for Kant thinking. There's no form of social collapse that could be just, because it breaks relations and hinders our ability to keep promises and duties, and thus our ability to have dignity. Yeah. Therefore, it must be forever wrong, regardless of if the reason why it would happen is other offenses against morality, which is also the basic logic of that stupid murder lie,
right? Yeah.
Lying promise thing that we talked about earlier. Whereas Islam, but almost any virtue ethic set has modal and hierarchy, has modal logics related to virtues and hierarchies related to virtues. So some virtues are greater than others, and you have multiple systems of reasoning depending on what the context is. That's even true in Christianity. But if you're trying to secularize Christianity, you can't admit that, because it admits stuff like irrational divine revelation or something that implies that the world doesn't work rationally, which as if you're an early German idealist, you can't have God doing that. Ipso facto.
Right. Yeah. I mean, for Kant, right. The whole point is we need to justify why Christendom is legitimate without revelation, right? We actually don't need revelation in order to justify the legitimacy of Christendom. And well, but what I'm pointing out is that, well, there is a revelation in Kant, and the revelation in Kant is the disgustingness of Black people. I mean, that has to be revealed to us in order to get the whole thing underway, and that it's smuggled in, and that and
the disgustingness of all non-white people actually would be the logical implication.
Yeah. But he's particularly obsessed with Black people, right? But I mean, there's a hierarchy. Well, he hates. It's the red men and the Black men that are at the bottom of the hierarchy. He's got a whole system, and I don't know all the details.
Right.
But,
which surprisingly does not look that different from the actual social economic divides we see in the United States, and actually probably in Europe too. Although the quote "red man" is not really a non-settler European issue. So there we go.
Right.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, I definitely see how this is a problem. Can you talk about how this affects other leftist thinking, though? Because most leftists do not see themselves as Kantians.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I do think there is a strong element of Kantianism in 20th century academic Marxism. I mean, there is, and I think it comes in partly through Weber. So part of it is the Weberian influence on Marxism, I think, right? So I mean, Weber,
that late middle SPD turn.
I'm
being a jerk, but yeah. Weber was one of the. I mean, we forget this, but Weber was one of the non-Bernsteinian revisionists of the late SPD, of the early 20th century, but late as far as classical SPD thinkers. He comes out of the SPD.
Well, I mean, Weber's whole idea is that, like, he believes that, like, that European modernity really is a rational society. He thinks it's kind of bad, I mean, but he accepts that it's true,
It's dark Kant.
Yeah, dark. Yeah, it's Kant, but he's against it, but he thinks it's true, right? I mean, and so Weber kind of thinks that white people invented rationality, right? Only it's a problem for us. And so there's that element of it, but more troublingly is actually goes back to the money stuff. I mean, which is that, well, I mean, Marxists really do believe that they have to derive a concept of value out of pure reason. And they need to then apply this concept to history in order to interpret it. Otherwise, you're going to understand history wrong. I mean, they really think that there's a concept of value, and they're going to derive it first, and then they're going to make history appear to them in those terms. Whereas I'm an empiricist. I think we should look at the facts as we're able to find them, and we should be critical about we should be wary of the ways that our preconceived ideas shape what can appear to us and all of that, but like that's a problem for us, not a good thing. It's not good that we have an a priori idea of value that we can then apply to history. Actually, we want to look at history and try to use that to disrupt our a priori notions of value and all that stuff. So I do think that there's a strong element of Kantianism in value form analysis in Marxism, because I mean there's nothing that you could empirically discover in the world that would threaten that analysis, which is also the case in Kant, right? I mean Kantians don't even think that here's a wild thing, right? Is that Kantians don't even think that Einstein is a problem for Kant. In fact, Einstein himself believed that he had destroyed Kant. I mean because what did Einstein show? Well, he showed that we learned about space and time from experience. And the Kantians' response to this seems to be basically like, well, like Kant just got the details wrong. So after we learned that space and time were different than we thought, we're going to go back and derive it a priori to match up to what we should have gotten right. So, but this doesn't make any sense. So
this always reminds me of something my one of my key philosophy professors, Dr. Fernald, who's now running an ethical consulting agency or something, used to tell me about Kantians and Platonists and even Aristotelians. He told me that you can't take a philosopher seriously when they assert that, because nobody holds those epistemic claims, and if they do and still try to maintain modern views of the world, they're doing so by bracketing parts that are uncomfortable out of the system. And I've seen this with one of my Bitnors. I don't have a hatred for Hegel, but I have always told people, if you don't deal with Hegel as a religious thinker, and if you think that you can do the Zizekian like bait and switch and say he's not talking about metaphysics, actually not even ontology, that he's not talking about metaphysics, that you can't really understand him, and to claim that it's just psychological is anachronistic. And there's no and if you actually read what Hegel says, you have to ignore what Hegel says about his own thought to make those leaps. And I think a lot of that happens with Kant in regards to the rational world being basically a form of predicate logic where everything is deduced from everything else and everything works off deductive logical forms. And the one thing I will give analytic philosophy is it has realized in the 20th century that doesn't work. Like, you literally, everything eventually from that standpoint becomes circular. Everything becomes circular. Like, because you always eventually hit a preposition that you have no way of justifying. And this is a crisis for analytic philosophy. I think partly because even though they realize that the deductive logic thing doesn't work, that they don't really want to give it up, because how can we do math out of non-quanta if we give up our ability to say that you can deduce stuff from other stuff and it makes sense? It's one of those debates. I remember when I was an undergrad in philosophy, where I was learning about all these philosophical theories, and I just remember hearing Kant and then hearing Hume, and just like, Hume's right. I don't even know like how you can argue that.
Right.
like it's just like I can deduce from a series of deductions, and ultimately, but my primary assertion has to be just basically a leap of faith. But I'm not going to say that, because if I say that and admit that, then I've collapsed every other deduction that I've made. Like, come on. Yeah. So you think that modern Marxism still has Kantianism, particularly in its obsession with value form and some of its ethical normative commitments and its relationships to like deducing theories of history from laws of history, and the laws of history aren't statistical, but
yeah, I mean,
axiomatical in some way.
But I mean, we also have to remember that, you know, what's the purpose of this value theory? Well, it's to construct a narrative about the direction of history. I mean, it's the purpose of it is to locate ourselves in history, and I think that the secularization of Christian sacred history that Kant kind of initiates, and it's carried on by Hegel, is inherited by Marxists, who see themselves as living after a fall and in anticipation of redemption. I mean, structurally, it is Christian sacred history, and
so you're saying Nietzsche had a point.
Yeah, I mean, like in a way, like sometimes when I say this, people are like, "Oh, you're playing like cheap gotchas or whatever." But like for me, that's like the nicest thing that I'm ever going to say about Marxism is that really it's a Christian heresy. I mean, and it's one Christian heresy in a long line of Christian heresies. That's nice, you know. That's the nice thing about Marxism.
No, it does make it. Part of me wants to defend elements of Marxism against some of these claims, but some of this stuff I actually, in my experience, I have seen, where I have argued that like you can't deductively describe an economy based off of typologies that you just want to apply post facto. And I mean, my favorite ones, I'm swiping at Trotskyist here, but all Marxist subcategories have done this. All right, they've just done it different ways, but the Trotskyist one is most obvious. What is the USSR? Is it a degenerated worker state? Is it state capitalism? Is it bureaucratic collectivism? And you actually read the definitions, and if you read them closely, you're like, guys, you guys are arguing about something where, like, from your own definitions, these three conditions could actually simultaneously be true of one state. But you have asserted that the typology needs to be maintained, partly for like rhetorical reasons that you didn't justify logically, to the point that you can't even see that some of these criterion have completely different things that they're focusing on as the tripping criterion. And then you get into points like when you argue about people about the actual economy of the USSR, which, you know, I do have my own theory about it. I tend to believe that the description of it as a non-mode of production, because it's fucking incoherent, is probably closest to truth. But you can tell that people are operating backwards. Like someone will say, okay, well, the USSR is state capitalist. And you go, why? Because it was producing value. Okay. Why was it producing value? Because there was market forces. Were those market forces actually operating with no price controls and free exchange? No. Was there even a singular market for currency in that? No. There was, even in most of the USSR's history, 3 different ruble trading points. Like, you had a different monetary system of exchange at 3 different levels. Now
I'm gonna have to figure that. I'm gonna have to look at this. I know nothing about this, but it's
now
you're talking my language.
Yeah, I mean, but it's just like, so I went and just looked at this, and I was like, okay, from the standpoint of there still being markets and there still being value, surplus produced, that is surplus labor that produces a surplus product that is being recommodified, that is true. But I can't think of a society that doesn't do that. And if you read the critique of the Goethe program, Marx mocks people giving their full earning back to them by the, like he just laughs at that, because he realizes that of course society would ultimately fall apart if no one shares the surplus at all, and if you don't generate any, because if you don't generate any surplus, everything goes back to the workers themselves, and what happens to anyone who cannot work.
Well, I mean, but the problem is here is they're idealists. They're doing idealism. They begin with a concept and then they judge the world according to whether it lives up to that concept or not. And yeah, nothing in the world lives up to that concept. That's because the instantiation of the concept in the world is the telos of history, right? I mean, this all comes from Kant. I mean, it's a spin on Kant. It's a critique of Kant. Yeah, it's a critique of Kant. But there's still a path defendants there, and you're still taking on board certain kinds of assumptions, and I think more importantly, certain kinds of narrative structures, right? And that I think are worth being skeptical of.
It is interesting to compare like the emergence of other like. I've always wanted people to take more seriously like the way secular emergence happens in maybe Islamic culture, but even Islamic culture, if we're honest, are the Christian or the post-Christian West, like envy and competition with Islamic culture, and this may also be true in reverse, frankly, has partly to do with the fact it's so close to it's close enough that we know the differences. Whereas if you look at
yeah, well, I mean, I was going to say, I mean, the West is incredibly influenced by Islam. I mean, and it seems that Christian thinkers stopped quoting Muslims sometime around the 16th century.
Yeah, really late.
Yeah, really late. And so it's something that I'm still thinking about. It's something I'd like to think about more. And in particular, what I want to do some research and I want to look into.
Actually, they quit doing it even after the war stance between the two if you look at like the idea of of Islam and Christianity at eternal war, the time when they quit,
that's what the influence is happening. That's what the influence is happening, right? Yeah, it's like, I mean, if you're sending a bunch of troops to the Holy Land who are in many ways becoming assimilated to the local Arabic custom. I mean that's the war is when the influence happens. I mean it's kind of. I want to look at it in particular. I want to look at Muslims in the early Atlantic world because I'm really interested. So we talked a little bit. I think you mentioned it before. This problem about slavery and Christianity, which is that you're not supposed to enslave Christians, right? And this is part of this is part of the reason that whiteness gets invented is because, well, if you're white instead of Christian, then that's a reason that you can enslave your slaves. But I've been wondering, okay, so why did they convert the slaves to Christianity in the first place?
They didn't. It was that they were buying slaves from pagan and Arab traders, Muslim Arab traders who had enslaved Christians.
Who were already Christians.
And they just didn't want to deal with that fact. Like they didn't want to deal with like Ethiopians being traded as slaves, basically. Now.
But the other option was Islam, though, because surely there must have been Muslims coming over on the ships too, right? This is what I'd like to research more about. I don't know yet.
Well, what's interesting is Muslims didn't engage in transatlantic naval powers. This is actually an area where I don't know as much because I know much about the land routes of.
So I know. Okay, so here's a data point, which is that one of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution was a man named Bookman, and that means Muslim. So the line of thinking that I've been pursuing, is like if I'm a slave owner in the 15th century or whatever, 14th century, what century are we talking about? 15th, 16th century. Who am I most afraid of? I think I'm most afraid of the imam on the slave ship who might organize the slaves. And I would rather.
Well, also it's the only person who yeah, I mean, once you get there, although you would rather them be nothing at first, so
I'd rather them
by language.
Yeah, I'd rather them be pagans. Right?
But pagans and housing peoples who don't speak the same language together, which is what they normally did. But I mean, Islam is in Africa would give them a counterforce. I mean, the only thing I will say though is if you get deep into race history in Islam, there is also evidence concurrently to Europeans developing a concept of race. High Caliphate Muslims were doing it too. You see this in the writings of Ibn Khaldun, because they were also taking Muslim slaves, but not of the same sect is kind of a bad translation, but like some of them were taking Shia slaves, which is still kind of forbidden.
Right. Yeah.
And
yeah,
so,
I mean, I'm not trying to hold Islam out as having everything right or whatever, but the point is, I take Islam at least as seriously as I take Kant, and if I put them both on the table and
take
compare
Islam
them
more seriously than I take Kant.
right. Yeah.
I mean, the one thing I will say is, for example, in America, the construction of a like Judeo-Christian culture was always hilarious to me, because if you, and a lot of American Jews don't realize this until recently, but if you look at the history, not just the development of Jews in Muslim lands, but also like literally the structure of the religion is closer. Like the focus on law, the focus on oral tradition being an interpretation of law, the way Hadith functions like Talmudic injunction and rabbinic edict, the way that judges are actually the supreme arbiters, not priests. That
neither. I mean, Judaism hasn't had a central authority since the 70s AD, and Islam never really had one. So I mean, there's nothing comparable to the Roman Church in the history.
No, absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, arguably the Caliph is, interestingly, yeah, there's nothing comparable to the Roman Church. There might be something comparable to the Eastern Church if the Caliph is a figure like the Emperor, but that's kind of a rough thing. But I find this fascinating because I was going to say, we don't even study how wildly different this is in cultures, even cultures that are highly influenced by things like Marxism. Like I think, I don't buy the whole narrative that you see from this, the CPC, that you needed to like 4,000 years of Confucianism for Marxist communism to be possible, because that seems like kind of laughable to me. But also because the more I study about Confucianism, the more I'm like, that's not a coherent religion. Like, it's changed what it is many times in many epochs. It's a very, since it has
Confucius, it's very secular. I mean, it's a secularism almost. I mean,
it's a secular religion that occasionally has gods and sometimes doesn't, and occasionally has consistent rules and sometimes doesn't. It's fun like that. But it's interesting when you look at like what secularity looks like in different areas. Because, for example, South Korea is on paper a more secular society than the United States. But that secularity does not look or feel like Western secularity. And that is despite a strong influence of Christian missionaries. And in fact, what you actually see is Christianity taking the character of Confucianism and the other indigenous religions, with filial piety and stuff like that. And that carrying through to secular ethics in a way that you wouldn't expect for a country that is a third Christian. And it was funny because I had a Korean professor who would just tell me all Americans are really Protestants, whether they are or not, and all Confucians are really, and all Koreans are really Confucians, whether they are or not. And it was like, and I kind of laughed, but the more I stayed there, the more I saw the point. Like, and it used to like muck with my when I first became a Marxist and was trying to hold the absolutely true orthodox line, would be like, okay, so if I say capital is world totality and all this stuff is epiphenomenal, but this stuff actually does affect like boss relations, legal structures, legal implementations of the law, how can I continuously assert that it's all just epiphenomenal? Now, I realize that was a stupid, vulgar Marxist reading of even Marx, but it's a common enough one that when people go, well, capital works the same way. And I will say, like, yes, in the grand scheme of the way profit motives work, yes. But its construction varies wildly from place to place, and how, like, even in the terms of like how you would exploit someone. So like in Korea, it is often seen as better to have, a whole lot of people employed at a place inefficiently by our standards and pay them very little. So, you and
this is what Origi gets about at Adam Smith in Beijing, which I haven't read
right.
in 8 years, but this is the industrious revolution thesis, right?
Right. And, I don't totally completely buy all Origi's categories, but it's just stuff that I saw. And even in stuff like the way you set up community structures and like how you show off ostentation and wealth and who's allowed to act like a boss and who isn't in what context. It even varies between Catholic cultures and Protestant cultures. Like, it's different.
Right.
I
mean, I believe this totally. I mean, I definitely think we're all Protestants. I mean, and I think the reason for this is that you can take a narrative structure and you can replace the words in it, but as long as you're still telling the same story, it doesn't matter who the cast is, and that's a lot of what happens with this kind of stuff. And it's a source of cultural creativity. I mean, you don't end up with exactly the same thing that you got before, but I think it's, just because you don't have characters named like Jesus and God and your narrative anymore doesn't mean you're not telling the same story.
Yeah, well, I mean, it does feel like a miserationism and as a structural story. Capital came in. The entirety of history has different lapses from primitive communism. Primitive communism probably isn't ideal, but it was the best we had to ideal. It was close to species being. You have this, and then you have, the conditions will get so bad that the workers will necessarily revolt. Now, I will also admit, in Marx, having read a ton of Marx, he's not consistent on that. But when people tell me he never said it, I can just be like, no, I can show you like this letter from 1850, where he said it explicitly and thought it was imminent.
Right.
Like, he thought it was going to happen by 1856. Like, and
well, look, I mean, disappointed eschatological expectations that's where religions come from, right? I mean, this is this is Christianity too, right? I mean, the earliest generation of the followers.
Oh yeah, it was clear that they didn't believe that anybody was going to survive more than like 10 years.
Yeah. And then the religion gets created when you try to deal with the failure of your eschatological expectations. I mean, this is what's happened to Marxism. It's obvious. I mean,
yeah. Well, to me, it's like where it's the one point that Karl Popper, who I normally think is a fool, made that I thought kind of sticks. Is that Marxism really does have a research program, but as it gets frustrated, it gives up on its research program and holds to its categorical predictions, which is and not just like its categorical prediction about business cycles, like its categorical positions about the necessity of a specific group of people to do a specific thing to bring it about worldwide in a very vague way.
But this is where the Kant is, right? I mean, this is because Kant's whole thing is, look, I mean, the human species has to realize its purpose, and the whole point is to identify the group of people who are going to be the ones who are the bearers of that historical mission. I mean, it's the same story. I mean, there's different characters in the story, and there's different other pieces of it. But why should we believe any of that? Why should we believe that there's a historical mission of humankind? I mean, I don't think that. I have much more mundane concerns, but I think that's very difficult for people to give up on, and is the idea that humanity has a historical mission that's going to be fulfilled if only we can understand what it is, and we can carry it out, But
yeah, it's one of those things when you confront Marx. And I say confront as a person who probably still believes a lot more Marx than you do, but where I do go to people and I was like, where's your workers' movement? And they'll just be like, it exists. And I'm like, where's your workers' movement? And
because Varn, you're looking for the phenomenal workers movement. They're talking about the noumenal workers movement.
Yeah, and then they'll be like the workers' movement for itself versus the workers' movement in itself. And I'm like, so you're telling me that the for itself is not. I mean, excuse me, that the for itself is not related to the in itself. That we could create a workers' movement out of the ontological being of communism without the workers that we've already argued are the people we have to have, not because of the ontological being of communism, but because of their position empirically in society. To do it, you've had 150 years. So even if you're right about the machinations of capitalism and business cycles and accumulation and monopoly capital, which I think Marx mostly is actually, it doesn't, like your predictions about revolution, you have spent at least since the 1920s kind of spinning your wheels, coming up with new theories for why your prediction didn't happen, and they get more and more disconnected from empirical inputs. Like, I actually understand why during the Long Depression you would have thought capitalism was going to end very soon, even though it was also just beginning in most of the world.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I say this as a person who believes in things like the tendency of the rates of profits to fall if you measure profits in commodity value and not currency. But there's all kinds of parts of economics I also feel Marx just doesn't really speak to that much. Like, he's got several different theories of money, kind of. I
mean, I think this gets us to the question of how do we think about what we're doing when we read these texts? I mean, what is our investment in the text? And I think think about the thing that everybody says. Like this phrase people say. They say, "I'm trying to understand Marx." How many people have said that? Like, I'm trying to understand Marx. I'm trying to understand Hegel. Like, why do we begin by approaching the text assuming that our job is to try to understand?
I do think of Stephen Jay Gould saying that it would be a failure of science if we were still talking about evolution in terms of trying to interpret the textual exegesis of origins of the species.
Yeah, well, I have my own thoughts about scientists' attitude. I think scientists would do well to study the intellectual history of their own disciplines more than they do. I've lived with biologists who have told me quite proudly that they don't read Darwin, and I always. Or even who have reacted with scorn when I told them I was reading Darwin. I mean, I was working with one of my colleagues. We were kind of tracing this history of the species idea, like from Aristotle and Theophrastus and all this stuff through Darwin. And we were reading this, and I told some of my biology roommates, and they were like, real scientists don't read Darwin. I was like, I don't know, it seems like you're missing out. But anyway, but it's not that I think that I don't have this like progressivist view where it's like, oh, we've advanced beyond Marx, and so now why he's been discredited or whatever. This is not my. I actually do think people should read Marx. I mean, I think that he's you can't really understand the intellectual history of economic thought unless you've read Marx. I mean, I think he should be on the syllabus. But I guess my point is, like, why do we begin by assuming that guy must be smarter than we are? Right. I mean, why can't we approach books by assuming that we're equals with the author of the text? So why begin from this position of humility to be like, well, I have to try to understand Marx, and it's going to be a lifetime, a work of trying to. I mean, why can't we begin by saying, yeah, I mean, spend 3 months studying Marx, and you'll probably pretty much understand it, and then you can think about it and you can make use of it, or you can reject it, or you can go other places from it, right? I mean, so I'm very much, I guess, after having spent almost a decade in higher education, in academia and all this stuff, I mean, why reverence? Why Marx didn't approach text with reverence?
No, and he actually didn't encourage people to approach him with reverence either.
Right. So why reverence? Right. I mean, I'm against reverence. I don't think we should approach whatever we have to learn from reading these texts that we've inherited from this very dubious history of the last 200 years of European modernity. Right. I mean, nobody's innocent in this history, and that's okay. I mean, the world is a violent place, and I don't, Kant's a bad guy, but a lot of guys are bad guys. I just,
right.
It's like, but like, why don't we say Immanuel Kant in the same way that we say Carl Schmitt, right? I mean, when you say I'm reading Schmitt, that means something, right? And there's a certain kind of like thing with that. Like my claim is really we should understand Kant in the same way. I mean, if you're reading Kant, it's like you're reading Schmitt, and you need to be thinking about that. You need to be understanding. I think we can read text because we want to understand how the enemy thinks, right? Mm. So this is why I've been reading Kant. I mean, I've been reading Kant like fairly intently. It makes me mad. It makes me angry. It really puts me in a bad mood because I hate the guy. I just despise him. But I do want to read him because I want to know how there's a logic. I mean, the enemy has a logic. The enemy thinks thoughts, and if I understand that, then I can fight the enemy more efficiently, and that might be a reason that I want to read these texts and everything. Yeah. So I just why begin with I mean reverence might be the end product of your reading, but I think there's a pathology in the way that we relate to these texts, and it's something that kind of like the popular left has learned from the university in the way that the discourses of the popular left kind of trickle down from the university in a certain kind of way, and they've learned to kind of perform this reverence, and I think a lot of it has to do with anxiety, right? So like if I'm anxious about, say I enter into this world of online discourse, and everybody's on there yelling at everybody else about how nobody understands Marx, and they've all been doing this for 40 years, and there's all of these, and you get really anxious because you're like, oh shit, maybe I don't understand Marx. And I think you this performance of reverence is a way to deal with our own anxiety and feelings of inadequacy. But I think you can actually just read it. I don't think it's that hard. Like I don't think, I mean, there's problems in it, but you can kind of get the basic idea, and you don't need to perform this obeisance to the text.
Right. Well, it's one of these things that I find maddening. Actually, is a lot of people who do have this sake of reverence. It's actually very similar to Christians approaching the Bible, honestly, and I don't mean that in the facile way. Oh, they're just religious. I mean that in the sense that like they've also been taught a hermeneutic and an exegesis before they approach the text that actually inhibits them from reading it.
Yeah. Right. Yes, exactly.
Because it's totally decontextualized. And when you come with someone like Marx, and I meant this as a person who will always argue like this is not what Marx actually thought, but that's actually a separate question than whether or not something is true, which people often misunderstand me when I say that, because I'm like, Marx, like I always say, I don't believe in the immiseration thesis. I'm not sure Marx did all of his life, but he sure as hell did in the 1850s for sure. And I'm also not going to come up with some fancy like structural structural break based on epistemology and some like early 20th century notions of physics and structural linguistics, and try to just assert my way out of these problems where there's inconsistencies, particularly who on earth would do that? Yeah. Particularly in areas where like we're deducing ourselves from unfinished text, which with Marx in particular is most of it.
Right.
Like, it is like reading breadcrumbs, and it's maddening when people treat exegetical claims as truth claims, because we should at least in our heads be like, okay, this is what this text says. There may be multiple readings of this text, but I do think there's been a tendency, unfortunately, also from literary academia to approach social meanings of text as if that meant that like basically I can impose any narrative heuristic on it and it's still valid. And my favorite one is like literary readings of Das Kapital, and I'm like, why would you do that? Like,
yeah, they only want to talk about the dancing tables and that kind of stuff.
Right. I mean, Jameson's guilty of this, right? Like, we're gonna have a literary analysis of Das Kapital, and I'm like,
right. Yeah,
why?
Well, why don't we think about political economy? That seems more interesting to me. I mean, yeah, but I mean, it's you know, so the other thing I wanted to point out is, you know, so the same person who told me that, you know, the Kantians are going to destroy me. I mean, there seems to be some anxiety that people have who have gone through German studies programs about the Kantians. Apparently, there's some really mean Kantians and who seem to enjoy abusing grad students and making them feel stupid. And they come out with this trauma around it. It seems to me, but the same person, and I've heard other professors say this in let me say, for similarly reactionary purposes, but they say things like you have to love the text, right? Or this one that I loved, which is from a slightly different person, is say yes to the text, right? So there's this idea that that this seems to be kind of common among a certain kind of type of literary. You know, and what are they trying to do, right? They're trying to overcome the resistance of like 18-year-old undergrads who think they know everything already, and they don't want to read the text because they already know everything, right? So you combat that by saying, well, you have to say yes to the text. You have to love the text. Let's read it with love or whatever. But so I agree that, right, 18-year-olds who think they know everything and don't have anything to learn from reading a book, like that's a certain kind of problem. But I think that it makes things worse when you promote this kind of like positive affect towards the text as the precondition for reading, right? Because I don't feel that. I don't think that's the best way to read. I mean, I think about reading as a kind of combative activity, right? I mean, like when I want to, why read Kant? I want to read Kant so that I can get stronger. And the way that I'm going to get stronger is by fighting Kant. So when I read a book, it's like, okay, you're in the boxing ring. You know, you're trying to fight to become a better boxer. And if you stepped into the ring and said, "Oh, I'm going to love my opponent. I'm going to say yes to my opponent," I mean, you'd be bad at boxing. You wouldn't become stronger. And that is it, at least as valid of a way to approach a text as beginning by assuming that it has something of value that is hidden behind the difficulty of the text to read, and our job is to try to understand it so that we can possibly approach to the greatness of, like, yeah, I mean, you could read that way, or you could pick it up and kick its ass, right? I mean, and why do one rather than the other? So,
I don't know. Yeah, I think that's actually a good approach. I think, you know, I think that's why, like, a lot of my favorite Marxists right now are not, honestly, would not be considered by most people Marxists, because they don't deny basic facts that are empirically provable, such as like only 17% only between 12 and 18%, depending on who's calculating and what groups you include, of the workforce in America are in anything like an organized shop, and that does not seem to be a trend that has been strategically buckable, and that you can't pretend that laws nor the ability of things like capital flight between states does not, it's just a matter of will, and that all the workers who don't do what you said they are rubes not for doing it, which is my other favorite thing, because it both does a sanctification of workers on the left while simultaneously calling them morons when they don't do what you want.
Again, you have an ideal of what they ought to be, and empirically existing humans fail to live up to the ideal, and so you judge them according to the ideal. That's Kant's practical philosophy.
I mean, I mean, and I guess this may be the rational core of the Kolakowskian critique I mentioned all the way back at the beginning of this conversation, is that there is a sense in which this thread of absolute formalism is embedded in not just Christian culture, but Greco-Roman culture going back to the Neoplatonist, and I would also add that it has a major effect on Islam. But and it's very interesting to deal with cultures that have, say, like nominalistic assumptions like Buddhism and Confucianism about like categories. They're inherently skeptical of categories themselves, even though they'll have lists of categories and category types. They'll also, they're also assert in the very next sentence that they're not real. That
I think the more categories you have, the harder it is to believe in their reality, right? I mean, people who really believe in categories have only a few of them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's why we simplify causation to the things that we want to deal with. And it's been frustrating for me dealing with Marxists because this does have political implications. Like if you're constantly yelling at people for not doing what you want them to do, but you're also saying that this is normally not just what they should do, but what has to happen, and then you literally have to come up with concepts of like, well, this working class person doesn't have a working class consciousness, whatever the fuck that means. Like, because they're not engaging in they're not coming to the conclusion that I have already deduced they should come to, even though that deduction doesn't come from them, never did, and is based on a set of assumptions. And if I have any intervention in Marxism, I want people, and this is something I think that it does go back to the core. People need to stop doing that, because you've had 200 years of failure, are saying stuff like, oh, we have the absolute revolutionary program, just do what Lenin, Stalin, Mao, etc., and then looking at it and going like, their programs ended, I don't know, a generation ago in most cases. Why do you keep on asserting that? It'd be like if I was asserting that we had the absolute correct truth to X, and I've been disproven. I feel like a shitty fortune teller.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the point here is that we don't need the absolute universal concepts. What we need are concepts that are adequate to the problems that face us. And I think the time has really come to really consider what, if anything, is the value of continuing to try to work with the concepts that we've inherited from the last 200 years of Western philosophy, and to what extent we might be better off jettisoning them and just looking for other concepts from other places, Islam, other whatever else. I mean, making our own. I think the time has really come to really reconsider our relation to the last 200 years of German philosophy, which really ultimately all comes from the German idealism. Which is,
even the analytics don't get out of it.
Which is well, it has certain problematic elements to it, particularly with respect to theories of race. I mean, so I do think I think we have to take racism really seriously. I think we have to take structural white supremacy really seriously, because the way I see it, I mean, that's climate change is gonna the war against climate change is gonna founder on the rock of white supremacy. Because white supremacy is a death cult, and there is like this, there's this element of like pursuing our notion of ourselves as universal law-giving subjects, as rational Western Europeans, that is sort of like really a kind of irrational death cult that's going to destroy the planet. And maybe it would be good to consider what kind of thoughts we could think if we just abandoned that. If we just said, well, maybe Kant has nothing to teach us, and maybe the fact that all of these other people are responding to Kant has locked them into a certain, and let's see what happens if we just abandon all of that and stop being intimidated by these vain, shallow university professors who want us to think that they're the only ones who know how to read all of this stuff, and so they're the only ones who can tell us what universal reason really is. I mean, that's the other problem, right? Is that Kant says that this philosophy is something that any rational being can understand immediately, and in fact they do, in order to have experience. But then only the university professors can tell us what it means, and it's so complicated that they have to spend 30 years studying it in order to understand it. I mean, it's in a way it's like self-defeating already. I mean, you've already undermined Kant the moment that you say that he's hard to understand. You know, because
that's actually true for a lot of philosophers, though. To be fair, but yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like philosophers are not hard to understand. I mean, yeah, you got to learn how to read. I mean, it's not so easy, but you know, I mean, I think we should stop. We should stop sort of like praising the difficulty of philosophers as a way to puff ourselves up for being able to understand them, and instead approach them by saying, yeah, I mean, you know, we can understand this pretty quickly. That's not the hard part. The hard part is it true? What are we going to do with it? What are the alternatives? I don't know. I think we should get the university professors out of our brains. That's the point.
So we'll end this podcast episode with Colin saying that Maoists were right, that we should rusticate the intellectuals.
I'm not. Hey, I'm engaged in the process of self-rustification right now, so I'm doing my best.
That's true. You actually do live on the side of a mountain as an academic, so that's fair.
I'm trying to get other people out here with me. Yeah, I'm gonna raise some goats. We're gonna raise goats, read books. It'll be good times. Kant would thoroughly disapprove. Anyway, so yeah, thanks for having me on. I feel like that's a natural place for the conversation to wrap up.
Yep.
It's been a pleasure.
It was fun.
Yeah, thanks. Right away.